Vampire King complains she is a burden on his freedom. She overhears, frees him. Moonlight poured through the tall, fractured windows of the ancient castle, falling in silver streams onto the cold stone floors. Shadows stretched and twisted like living creatures across the walls, and the silence of the night was heavy, filled with unspoken words and forgotten memories. Lady Seraphine moved quietly along the corridors, her bare fingers tracing the carvings of centuries-old kings and queens. Every step she took echoed faintly, a reminder that she was alone, or perhaps that she was never truly alone in a place as old as this. The castle belonged to Kale, the Vampire King, ruler of lands that no mortal dared to tread after sunset. Tall, commanding, and impossibly beautiful, he held the weight of centuries in his dark eyes, and his presence could both chill and enthrall. Seraphine had served him for months, bound by duty, but also by an invisible thread of curiosity and fascination. There were nights when she thought she understood him, glimpses of a heart buried beneath pride and loneliness, but there were far more nights when he seemed untouchable, a storm contained in flesh and shadow. She paused outside the throne room, drawn by the low murmur of his voice. Curiosity overcame caution, and she leaned closer, pressing her ear to the cold door. "A burden on my freedom," Kale muttered, his voice almost a whisper. "I cannot be tied to anyone, not even her. She does not belong to this world, and yet she is here and I cannot deny it." The words struck her like ice. Her chest tightened, and for a heartbeat, she felt as though the world had stopped. He had spoken of her, and not with anger, but with a strange mixture of frustration and longing. It was as though he were trying to fight the pull he felt, a pull he could not name aloud. Seraphine stepped back, her mind spinning. She wanted to flee, to hide from the truth she had just heard. But there was something in his confession, a vulnerability, a crack in his armor that made her ache to see more. She had always sensed that Kale's life was bound by invisible chains, not just of duty and power, but of some deeper, darker magic. Perhaps this was her chance to understand, to help, or even to free him. For nights, she had dreamt of strange shadows and whispers that called her name, guiding her through the castle's endless halls. She had felt the pull of a destiny she could not yet name, and now the first piece of its puzzle had revealed itself. Kale's freedom, his very soul, was restrained by something beyond even her understanding, and if she could help him, perhaps she could change the course of both their lives forever. The next morning, the castle seemed alive with hidden murmurs. Servants hurried about silently, their faces pale and tense. Seraphine made her way to the library, a towering hall of dusty tomes and crumbling scrolls. There, she hoped to find some knowledge of the ancient magic that bound Kale, something that could explain the strange shadows she had seen in her dreams. Hours passed as she pored over books written in languages older than the mountains themselves. Her fingers traced runes and sigils, each one seeming to hum faintly beneath her touch. And then, in a forgotten corner of the library, she found a scroll wrapped in black silk, sealed with a wax emblem she recognized, the mark of Kale's family. She unrolled it carefully, revealing a map of the castle and its surrounding lands, overlaid with a lattice of protective wards and seals. One seal, in particular, pulsed with a faint crimson light. Seraphine's breath caught in her throat. She knew at once that this was the source of Kale's restriction, the invisible chain that had made him speak of her as a burden. The scroll hinted at the way to break it, but the instructions were incomplete. A fragment was missing, a dangerous and unknown step that would require courage she was not certain she possessed. That night, she returned to the corridors, the scroll clutched to her chest. The castle felt colder than ever, the moonlight pale and distant. She knew Kale would be awake, as he always was, his senses sharp as a blade even in the deepest hours of night. Yet she could not wait. She needed to understand the truth, and perhaps, in doing so, she could free him from the cage he did not even fully see. Kale was in the throne room as expected, sitting silently atop his carved chair. The shadows clung to him like a cloak, and when he lifted his eyes to hers, the weight of centuries pressed down on them both. "Why are you here, Seraphine?" he asked, his voice smooth, deep, but not unkind. "I found something," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "Something about the seal about you. I think I can help." Kale's expression darkened, a flicker of anger mixed with curiosity. "Do you know what you are suggesting? Even if you could touch the magic that binds me, it could destroy you." "I know," she said, meeting his gaze. "I would rather risk myself than see you suffer, trapped in a cage you cannot even name." For a moment, the silence stretched between them, taut as a drawn bowstring. Then Kale rose, his movements fluid and dangerous, a predator's grace tempered by centuries of control. He circled her slowly, studying her as though deciding whether she was brave or foolish. "Do you understand what freedom means?" he asked quietly. "It is not simply leaving a room or ignoring a crown. Freedom comes with pain, with loss, with consequences that haunt the soul for eternity. Can you bear that?" Seraphine nodded, though doubt gnawed at her. "If I can help you, I will face whatever comes. I want to see you free, even if it costs everything." Kale's lips curved in a shadow of a smile, one that was both terrifying and tender. He extended a hand, not in command, but as a gesture of trust, the first she had ever seen from him. "You may not understand it yet," he said softly, "but perhaps you will be the one to remind me that even kings are not meant to live without choice." The words struck her heart like a bell tolling in a forgotten chapel. She reached out and their hands brushed. The contact was electric, not of desire but of connection, a recognition that two souls bound by fate could change the path of centuries. That night, Seraphine began the first step of the ritual. The castle seemed to hold its breath as she traced the runes in the air, her voice reciting the ancient words she barely understood. A faint wind stirred the shadows, and the candles flickered as though reacting to the pulse of her magic. Kale stood silently, watching her with a mixture of awe and apprehension. When she finished, a tremor passed through the walls, and the crimson seal on the scroll pulsed brighter, almost alive. For the first time, Kale did not look invincible. He looked fragile, as though a part of him had been waiting centuries for this moment of release. Seraphine's heart pounded. She had taken the first step, and already she could feel the shift in the air, the change in Kale. But she also knew this was only the beginning. There were darker forces in the castle, shadows that would not allow the king's freedom without a struggle, and she had no idea whether she was ready for what came next. Kale turned to her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You have begun something that cannot be undone," he said, his voice low and reverent. "Are you certain you understand the price?" Seraphine swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly. "I am certain, and I will not turn back no matter what comes." A silence followed, heavy with tension and unspoken emotion. Then, from deep within the castle, a low hum began, not from wind or stone, but from something older, more alive. The shadows writhed, and the air seemed to thicken around them. Kale's expression darkened, the king of shadows aware that his freedom was awakening forces long dormant. "Then we must face them, together," he whispered, his voice barely audible, yet filled with a weight that made Seraphine's blood run cold. And as the moonlight spilled across the floor, illuminating the two figures in the ancient throne room, Seraphine realized that she had set in motion a chain of events from which neither she nor Kale could turn back. Their destinies were entwined, bound by magic, fate, and a fragile hope of freedom. But beyond the walls of the castle, in the endless night, unseen eyes watched. Something was coming, something that would test their courage, their hearts, and the strength of the bond they had just begun to form. The first step had been taken. The shadows were stirring. And the night was far from over. The castle walls seemed to whisper as Lady Seraphine walked through the cold hallways. The seal she had begun to break had stirred something, and the air was thick with a strange energy, a pulse she could feel in her chest and fingertips. Outside, the night was silent, but the forest that surrounded the castle seemed alive. Trees twisted in unnatural shapes, their branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers, and shadows moved in ways that no wind could explain. Seraphine held the scroll tightly, her mind racing with the instructions she barely understood. The first step had been done, but the fragments of magic left in the castle were unstable. She knew that the next steps would be far more dangerous. She had to gather the ingredients for the ritual herbs that grew only in cursed soil, stones that shimmered with trapped light, and waters drawn from the moonlit river that ran through the forest. The night air was cold and damp as she stepped into the forest. Fog clung to the ground like a living blanket, curling around her feet and whispering secrets. Every sound seemed amplified: the distant rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch underfoot, the faint howl of a creature far away. She could not see the moon through the thick canopy, yet the forest glowed with an otherworldly light guiding her steps. She did not realize she was being followed. Kale moved silently behind her, a shadow among shadows. Though Seraphine had vowed to face this journey alone, he could not bring himself to leave her. Even partially freed, even tethered by the ritual, he felt drawn to her in ways he had spent centuries denying. Pride and fear warred in him, but the desire to protect, or perhaps to witness, this mortal who dared to touch his cursed life kept him close. Seraphine did not hear him at first. She was too focused on the twisted trees and the glowing mushrooms that marked the path she needed to follow. But then, a rustle too deliberate to be natural caught her attention. Her hand went instinctively to the dagger at her waist. "You need not be afraid," Kale's voice said, smooth and dark, echoing through the fog. She turned sharply, eyes wide. "I know you're here," she said, her voice steady despite the rapid beat of her heart. "I can feel your presence." He stepped into the faint light, his form tall and perfect, like a shadow made flesh. "And yet you continue alone," he said softly, his gaze assessing her. "Even after what you have begun, you do not hesitate. That is remarkable." Seraphine swallowed, unsure if his words were praise or a warning. "I cannot falter now. You have been trapped for centuries, Kale. I will not abandon you or myself." He studied her for a long moment. There was something in her courage that unsettled him, that made him aware of the depth of his own isolation. He had been alone for centuries, his life a careful balance of power and detachment. But she had stepped into his world without fear. She had touched his curse without flinching. And that was dangerous, not only for her but for him as well. The forest grew darker as they moved deeper. Strange creatures watched from the shadows, their eyes glowing with curiosity and hunger. The wind carried whispers of voices from the past, warnings from spirits long dead. Seraphine's pulse quickened, but she kept her hand steady on the scroll. Kale finally spoke again. "Do you understand the risk?" "I do," she said. "But I also understand the cost of leaving you trapped. I cannot watch you suffer." He shook his head slightly, a shadow of a smile crossing his face. "And yet you do not see what freedom truly is. You think it will bring joy, but it brings danger, solitude, and pain. It is a crown heavier than any king has ever known." Her gaze did not waver. "Then let me help you bear it. You do not have to carry it alone." For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a sudden fluid motion, he lifted into the air and moved beside her, gliding silently over the mossy forest floor. She followed, amazed at his grace and at the closeness that suddenly felt inevitable. They reached the river just as the moon broke through the clouds, spilling silver light onto the water. The river's surface shimmered, reflecting the pale glow, and Seraphine recognized the final component of the ritual: water drawn from the moonlight itself. Kale hovered above the riverbank, his dark eyes watching her every move. "Do you understand what will happen when you combine these elements?" he asked, voice soft but carrying the weight of centuries. "I think so," she said, kneeling by the river. It will stabilize the seal. But only for a moment. The rest will require courage beyond anything I have known. He said nothing, simply observing her as she dipped her hands into the cool, shimmering water. When she pulled it out, it glowed faintly, as though holding the light of the moon itself. Her fingers trembled, and Kale, for the first time, felt something shift inside him, a warmth he had thought long dead. Together, they began the ritual, chanting the ancient words inscribed on the scroll. The forest responded immediately. Fog swirled around them, the trees bent slightly as if bowing, and the shadows seemed to lean closer, listening. Seraphine's voice was steady, though her heart raced, and Kale's presence beside her was both grounding and electrifying. When the final words were spoken, the river flared with silver light, and a low hum filled the forest, vibrating through the ground and into their bones. The seal had responded, shifting, loosening its hold on Kale. For a brief moment he seemed lighter, freer, more human in his expression, less burdened by centuries of darkness. But the moment did not last. From the shadows, a sudden figure emerged, a pale, cloaked creature, its eyes glowing like molten gold. It was one of the ancient guardians of Kale's kingdom, bound to enforce the old laws, to ensure that no mortal dared tamper with the king's chains. "You dare touch what is forbidden," the figure hissed, voice like dry leaves scraping stone. "You mortal and you, vampire, you play with forces beyond your comprehension." Kale stepped forward, his body tense, muscles coiled like a predator ready to strike. "She is no mere mortal," he said, his voice low and commanding. "She has chosen to act with courage, and she will not be harmed for her loyalty." The guardian laughed, a sound that made the trees shiver. "Loyalty is meaningless where the rules of eternity apply. The king's freedom is not yours to grant." Seraphine's hands tightened on the scroll. Fear twisted in her stomach, but she did not step back. "Then we will face it together," she said, her voice firm, echoing across the riverbank. "I will not leave him to suffer." Kale's gaze softened for a brief second, filled with something she had not seen before, gratitude, yes, but also vulnerability. He was still the vampire king, still immensely powerful, but in that moment he was also human. The magic that bound him was not just a chain. It was a burden of time, of regret, of a life lived without choice. The guardian lunged, a blur of pale motion and golden eyes. Kale moved faster, intercepting the attack, and the world seemed to shift around them, trees bending, shadows swirling, the river glowing brighter with the energy of the confrontation. Seraphine felt a surge of courage, and instinctively she raised the glowing water in her hands, casting it toward the guardian. The silver light hit the creature, and for a heartbeat it faltered, stunned by the unexpected power of mortal will guided by magic. Kale seized the moment, using his newly freed strength to push the guardian back into the darkness, forcing it to retreat with a hiss that promised it would return. Breathless, Seraphine sank to her knees by the river, hands trembling. Kale knelt beside her, placing a heavy hand over hers. The touch was not threatening, it was grounding, a silent acknowledgement of what they had just shared: danger, courage, and trust. "You are foolish," Kale murmured, a hint of exasperation in his tone. "And yet I am grateful. You risk more than you know." Seraphine looked up at him, her chest tight with emotion. "And yet I would do it again, for you, for this chance to help you find freedom." Kale's eyes softened, and for the first time the centuries of darkness in his gaze seemed to waver. Perhaps you are the only one who could do what I never could. Perhaps even a king needs someone to remind him of courage." The forest fell silent again, the silver moonlight painting their figures in ethereal glow. Seraphine felt a strange exhilaration, a mixture of fear, relief, and something deeper, a bond forming that neither time nor magic could easily undo. Yet the sense of calm was fleeting. From deep within the trees, Seraphine heard a rustle, faint, deliberate, and unsettling. She glanced at Kale, who tensed, every muscle coiled, every sense alert. Something watches us, he said, his voice sharp, warning, and it knows we have begun a path that cannot be undone. Seraphine's heart pounded. She had taken another step toward freeing him, toward changing their destinies. But she realized now that the path ahead was far more dangerous than she had imagined. Not only the guardians, but darker forces, unseen and patient, waited in the shadows. And they would not let the Vampire King's chains be broken so easily. Kale's hand brushed hers again, a silent promise that they would face what was coming together. And yet the tension in his posture, the shadows in his eyes, told her that freedom came with a price neither of them could yet understand. The forest whispered around them, alive with secrets and unseen eyes, and the river glowed softly, as if echoing the uncertainty of what had been set in motion. Seraphine looked at Kale, feeling both the weight of responsibility and the strange, thrilling pull of something more, a connection, a bond, a hope she had never dared to name before. The first step had led them deeper into the unknown, and the night was far from over. Something stirred in the darkness, waiting, patient, watching. And when it struck next, they would have to face it together. The ruins of an ancient city lay before them, half swallowed by time and nature. Broken towers leaned precariously, and cobblestone streets were cracked and overgrown with thorny vines. The air was thick with the scent of moss, damp stone, and something older, the faint trace of magic that had lingered here for centuries. Lady Seraphine stepped carefully, her boots crunching softly on the rubble. Every shadow seemed to watch her, every gust of wind whispered secrets she could barely understand. Kale followed silently, his presence a dark, comforting shadow beside her. The ritual they had begun in the forest had shifted him. He was no longer fully bound, no longer constrained by the chains that had kept him locked in solitude for centuries. Yet freedom had a weight, and it showed in the tense lines of his shoulders, the storm in his dark eyes, and the rare moments when he looked uncertain, a king learning what it meant to truly live. Seraphine felt the change too. He was closer now, more human in ways she had never imagined. And yet, the danger that surrounded him was stronger than ever. The guardians, the shadows of the castle, and forces that even Kale did not fully understand were now aware that his chains had begun to loosen. "This place," Seraphine whispered, glancing at the ruins. "It feels alive." Kale nodded. "It holds memory. Every stone, every shadow carries a trace of what was kings and queens, victories and betrayals, the joys and the pain of centuries. Freedom does not erase them, it makes them louder, more urgent." She shivered, feeling the weight of history pressing down on them. "Then we must be careful," she said. "Every step we take could awaken more than we intend." Kale's gaze softened, and for the first time he allowed a faint human smile. "Careful, yes, but also brave. That is what you are, Seraphine. Brave enough to walk beside me when others would flee." Her heart tightened at his words. She had always felt a pull toward him, an attraction she could neither name nor resist. But it was more than desire. It was respect, curiosity, and something deeper, a recognition of his loneliness and the fragile hope she now carried in her hands. The city's center was dominated by a great courtyard, where a broken fountain sat, its water long dried, its statues crumbled by time. As they approached, a strange hum filled the air, vibrating through the stones and into their bones. Seraphine's fingers went to the scroll at her side, and Kale's senses sharpened. "Do you feel that?" he asked, voice low. "I do," she replied. "It's the magic, it's reacting to you." Kale's eyes darkened, partially freed and yet still tied to what is ancient. "The magic remembers me, remembers all I have lost, all I have endured. This city is a mirror of my soul, and it is angry." Seraphine stepped closer to him, instinctively offering a tether of courage. "Then we face it together. I will not let you be alone, not now." He turned to her, and for a heartbeat, the centuries of his isolation shone through his gaze. "You do not understand," he murmured. "I am dangerous, Seraphine. Not because I wish to harm, but because freedom is not kind. It awakens all that I have buried. I could lose myself, or worse, I could lose you. Her hand touched his, steadying him. Then let me be your anchor. Let me help you carry the weight. Kale exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Perhaps, perhaps you are the only one who could do this. Only you could walk beside a king and not crumble beneath the shadow of what he is. The courtyard trembled, and suddenly the shadows began to twist and writhe. Figures emerged from the darkness, ghostly echoes of the city's past, warriors, kings, and queens who had lived and died, bound to the land by magic and memory. They moved with silent purpose, their eyes glowing faintly, their presence a reminder that Kale's freedom would not come without struggle. Seraphine drew a deep breath. "They're here because of you," she said softly, "because your chains are breaking." Kale's lips tightened. "Yes, and they will test us. They will demand that I return to what I was or face destruction. The magic of this place does not forgive weakness." The shadows approached, their movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. Kale stepped forward, tall and commanding, his presence radiating authority. "I am no longer your prisoner," he declared, his voice echoing across the courtyard. "I am a king with choice. I will not be bound by fear, by chains, or by the past." The ghosts of the past paused as though considering his words. One figure, a woman draped in royal robes, stepped forward. Her voice was like wind over broken glass. "You defy what has held you for centuries," she said. "Freedom comes at a price, Kale. Do you understand that?" Kale's gaze met hers, unwavering. "I do, and I choose to face it, not for power, not for rule, but for the life I have denied myself, and for the one who dared to believe in me." Seraphine's breath caught. He spoke of her, even before any words passed between them. And in that moment, the connection between them deepened, unspoken but undeniable. The shadows reacted. The ground beneath their feet shivered, the ruins groaned, and a sudden gust of wind swept through the courtyard, carrying whispers of warning and challenge. Kale's eyes flickered with the raw energy of his partially freed power, beauty and danger intertwined. "Step back," he warned Seraphine, his voice both commanding and protective. "The magic here, it responds to me now. It will test you as well as me." She obeyed, standing close but safe, watching as Kale lifted his hands. Shadows bent and swirled around him, and for the first time she saw him truly unbound, not entirely free, but no longer held in chains. He was magnificent and terrible, a king awakening to his own strength, tempered by centuries of solitude. The confrontation was fierce but silent. Shadows surged forward, testing his control, and Kale moved like a storm made flesh. Every movement was precise, every gesture commanding the elements and the echoes of the past. Seraphine watched, breathless, her heart pounding not only with fear but with awe. She realized that freedom was not a gift, it was a responsibility, one that Kale now bore with a courage that inspired her. When the shadows finally recoiled, subdued by his presence, Kale turned to her. His eyes, dark and intense, held a vulnerability that few had ever seen. "Do you see now?" he asked softly. "The cost of freedom is not only danger, it is the weight of knowing who you are, of facing every shadow that has shaped you." Seraphine stepped closer, offering a gentle smile. "I see it. And I also see the strength you never allowed yourself to embrace. You are no longer trapped, not truly, and I will not leave you alone." Kale's expression softened, and for a moment the centuries of darkness in his gaze seemed to waver. He extended his hand and she took it without hesitation. The contact was grounding, a silent promise that they would face the dangers together. But the moment of calm was brief. A distant rumble echoed through the ruins, low and ominous. The ground trembled beneath their feet and Seraphine felt a chill run down her spine. Something ancient, something patient, was awakening deeper within the city. Kale's eyes narrowed. "It begins," he said quietly. "The magic here remembers me, and it does not forgive the living." Whatever comes next will test us, both of us, in ways we cannot yet imagine. Seraphine held his hand tighter. Then we face it together, she said, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her chest. The wind swept through the ruins, carrying whispers, shadows, and the weight of centuries. And as the moonlight bathed the broken city, Kale and Seraphine stood side by side, a mortal and a vampire, bound by trust, courage, and the fragile hope of freedom. The first steps had awakened more than magic. They had awakened a reckoning, and the night was far from over. In the deepest shadows of the city, unseen eyes watched. Patience lingered, waiting for the moment to strike. And when it did, Kale and Seraphine would have to confront not only the dangers around them, but the fears and desires that had been buried too long in the hearts of both the king and the mortal who dared to believe in him. The night held its breath. The citadel rose like a dark crown atop the jagged cliffs, its black stone gleaming under the pale light of the eclipsed moon. Lava flowed in molten streams along the cracks in the earth, casting a crimson glow that reflected off the walls and the faces of the few who dared to approach. Lady Seraphine and Kale had arrived at the place where the final test of freedom awaited. The air was thick with heat, magic, and an ancient weight that pressed down upon their shoulders like a living thing. Kale's steps were silent but heavy, each one measured, as though he carried the memory of centuries in his stride. The partial freedom he had gained in the forest and ruins had been a taste, a fleeting glimpse of what it meant to truly be unbound. Yet the citadel, alive with ancient magic, promised no mercy. "Are you ready?" Seraphine asked, her voice soft but steady. Her hands clutched the scroll that had guided them so far. Kale's dark eyes met hers. They were shadowed with uncertainty, pride, and a strange flicker of fear that he had long denied, and pride that refused to bow even to destiny. "I am," he said finally. "But understand, Seraphine, what happens here may change everything, not just for me but for you as well." "I will not leave you," she replied. "Whatever comes, we face it together." They entered the citadel, and the heat of the lava streams and the echo of shifting stones made Seraphine shiver. The hallways twisted unnaturally, as though the architecture itself were alive, moving and testing those who dared to step inside. Shadows gathered at the edges of vision, stretching and coiling like smoke. At the center of the citadel, in a vast hall carved into volcanic rock, they saw it, the ancient council of immortal lords. Pale and cold, they hovered above the molten ground, their eyes glowing with judgment and expectation. They were the arbiters of Kale's past, keepers of the chains he had broken. "You dare enter here," one of them said, voice like ice scraping over stone, "and yet you claim freedom. You forget the debts of eternity, Kale. You cannot escape what has bound you for centuries." Kale stepped forward, the shadows twisting around him as though acknowledging his defiance. "I do not deny the past," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "But I am more than chains, more than the fears that have ruled me. I have chosen my path. I choose freedom. And I choose her." The lords turned their eyes on Seraphine. She did not flinch, though her heart pounded. She met their gaze with quiet courage. Kale had trusted her, and she would not falter now. "Do you understand the cost?" one lord asked. "Freedom comes with sacrifice. One wrong step and all you hold dear will be destroyed." Kale's jaw tightened. "I understand, and I accept it." He glanced at Seraphine, who gave him a small nod, her hand brushing against his. The simple touch held more meaning than words could carry: courage, trust, and an unspoken bond forged in trials and danger. The council surged forward, a wave of shadow and cold intent, and the hall erupted into chaos. Kale moved like a storm, a force of dark grace, every motion precise and controlled. The air vibrated with his power, the energy of centuries finally freed from the bonds that had held it. The immortal lords recoiled, tested by the strength of a king who had reclaimed himself. Seraphine stayed close, raising her voice to chant the words of the final ritual. The scroll burned faintly in her hands, glowing with energy as the last step approached. Magic swirled around them, bright and dangerous, yet alive with the promise of transformation. Kale paused, lifting his hands. Shadows twisted around him, bending, bowing, and finally coiling into shapes that mirrored centuries of pain, loneliness, and regret. "This ends tonight," he said, voice low and steady. "I will not be ruled by the chains of the past, not by fear, not by ghosts." The lords hesitated, sensing the power in him, the determination that had been tempered by Seraphine's courage. She saw it in their eyes, respect mixed with wariness, a recognition that Kale was no longer the prisoner they had known. He turned to her, his expression softer now, almost human in its vulnerability. "We must finish this," he said, "together." Seraphine stepped forward, placing the scroll on a carved stone pedestal. She began the final incantation, her voice steady, her heart aligned with Kale's strength. Magic leapt from the words, coiling around them, bright and fierce. The citadel trembled and the lava glowed brighter, reacting to the bond between mortal and king, courage and power intertwined. Kale's shadowed form moved beside her, his presence protective and powerful. "Focus on the bond," he whispered. "The magic flows through both of us. Trust it, trust me." Seraphine nodded, eyes locked on him, heart beating in time with his. The shadows around them reacted violently, testing their unity, but the connection between them held strong. Together they channeled the magic, not as master and servant, but as equals, each giving strength to the other. The council tried one last surge, a wave of pure authority and judgment, but Kale and Seraphine met it head-on. Light and shadow collided, and the hall shook as though the world itself were holding its breath. And then, with a blinding flash, the chains of the past shattered. The lords recoiled, unable to maintain their hold over him. Kale's power, once constrained and burdened, surged free, tempered by courage, love, and choice. The shadows retreated, leaving the hall glowing softly in the aftermath of magic released. Kale fell to one knee, exhausted, but alive in a way he had not been for centuries. Seraphine knelt beside him, placing a hand over his. "It is done," she said, voice trembling with relief and awe. "You are free." Kale looked at her, eyes soft, dark, and infinitely deep. "Free," he whispered, repeating the word as though tasting it for the first time. "And it is because of you, because you believed in me." Her heart swelled with emotion. "We believed in each other," she said. "You did not walk alone. I never let you." He lifted her hand to his lips, a gesture of respect and devotion. Not ownership, not command, but recognition and gratitude. The centuries of solitude in his gaze softened, replaced by a quiet warmth that filled the hall like sunlight breaking through clouds. Kale rose, and together they walked to the highest balcony of the citadel. The eclipsed moon cast its silver light over the molten cliffs and distant lands, painting the world in eerie beauty. For the first time, Kale looked upon it not as a ruler bound by chains, but as a king choosing his own path. Seraphine stood beside him, feeling the weight of the journey, the courage required, and the bond that had carried them through danger, fear, and uncertainty. They had faced the past, confronted the guardians, and emerged stronger, connected not only by power but by trust, respect, and something neither of them had dared to name until now. "Kale," she whispered, "what now?" He turned to her, shadows and silver moonlight dancing across his features. "Now," he said softly, "we live, not bound by fear, not ruled by the past, but together. Whatever comes next, we face it together." The first rays of the returning moonlight illuminated their faces. Kale's hand brushed hers, and the gesture was simple, yet it carried the weight of centuries: choice, courage, and connection. Seraphine smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in months, but even as peace settled over the citadel, a faint rustle echoed from the shadows. The past was never fully gone, and the world was not without danger. Yet Kale and Seraphine, bound by trust, courage, and the power of their shared journey, stood ready. Freedom had been claimed. Redemption had been earned. And the bond between a mortal and a king, fragile, fierce, and beautiful, had been forged in fire, shadow, and moonlight. The eclipse faded and the world awoke, trembling but alive. Kale looked at Seraphine, dark eyes softened by emotion, and said, "We are not finished. Life still awaits, and now we face it as equals." Seraphine nodded, the weight of fear replaced by hope. "Together," she said. Together they stepped forward, leaving behind the shadows of the past, the chains of centuries, and the echoes of lost kings and queens. The night had tested them, but the dawn was theirs. And in the light of the new day, a king and the mortal who had freed him could finally see the world not as prisoners, but as two souls choosing to walk side by side.